Racist judge sentences innocent black youth. 5 years later, his daughter paid the price. The courtroom was ice cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the tension that coiled in every corner like a predator waiting to strike. The walls, a dull beige, seemed to close in tighter with every breath. 17-year-old Jalen Carter stood at the defendant's table, hands clenched at his sides, wearing a borrowed navy blazer that hung awkwardly on his lean frame. His mother, Melanie Carter, sat behind him, her fingers white-knuckled around a rosary she hadn't touched in years. They had walked in believing in truth, in the system, in justice. But justice wasn't present today. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Every person in the room stood as Judge Douglas Weller entered, his black robe billowing behind him like a storm cloud. His face was carved from stone, expressionless, unyielding. He didn't look at Jalen. He never had. Jalen's public defender, Mr. Alvarez, adjusted his glasses nervously as the clerk read the charge. One count of felony theft in the amount of $480.42 from Macklin's Electronics on the night of September 2nd. A ripple of disbelief moved through the gallery. Those who knew Jalen, his teachers, classmates, even his church pastor, knew he couldn't have done it. Not Jalen, not the straight-A student who tutored younger kids after school and spent weekends volunteering at the food bank. Not the boy who had been working his shift at the public library at the exact time the alleged theft occurred. But the judge's eyes were already glazed, uninterested. Evidence? Irrelevant. Truth? Inconvenient. Mr. Alvarez stood, voice clear, confident. "Your Honor, we have security footage from the library, timestamped 7:04 p.m. It clearly shows Jalen Carter checking in at the front desk and shelving books until 9 p.m. when the theft allegedly occurred. That's 2 solid hours of confirmed alibi." Judge Weller didn't flinch. Alvarez continued. "In addition, we have 4 witnesses who placed him there. His supervisor, 2 patrons, and the assistant librarian. All have submitted sworn affidavits. Further, the suspect caught on camera at the store was shorter, heavier, and wore a jacket with a school logo from a different district. The video played on a small monitor to the side. Grainy, but clear enough. The thief in the footage moved with a hunched posture. Jalen, standing tall and slender, barely resembled the figure. The room waited for a reaction from the bench. Nothing. Then came Judge Weller's voice, measured, slow, and dripping with disdain. "Mr. Alvarez, I've heard your client's glowing resume, but I've seen many young men with bright futures believe they're above the law. We are not here to discuss his community service. We are here to discuss the law he broke." Melanie's heart stopped. She stared at the judge wide-eyed. "He didn't break the law," she whispered, her voice strangled by panic. The gavel cracked down like a gunshot. "Order in the court." Jalen turned slightly, looking back at his mother. His eyes said everything. "I didn't do this. I swear." And Melanie, through the tears welling in her eyes, nodded. "I know, baby, I know." The prosecution, emboldened by the judge's apathy, smirked as they delivered their closing. "This is about deterrence, about showing our youth there are consequences for poor decisions." Poor decisions. Jalen's only decision had been clocking in on time at a library shift he never missed. The only thing he was guilty of was being a black teenager in the wrong courtroom. When Judge Weller rose to deliver the verdict, the courtroom felt like it had been placed underwater. Every breath was a battle. Every heartbeat pounded in everyone's ears like a war drum. "Jalen Carter," the judge began, peering over the rim of his glasses. "In light of the evidence presented, though some may find it compelling, this court finds you guilty of theft." Gasps erupted like gunfire. Melanie stood, hands trembling. "No! No, this is wrong! Look at the footage again!" 2 officers stepped forward, gently guiding her back down. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice remained sharp. "My son was at the library. You're destroying his life. Please!" Judge Weller banged his gavel again. "Enough!" Jalen didn't move. He couldn't. The words hadn't sunk in yet. "This court hereby sentences you to 2 years in juvenile correctional facility. Sentence begins immediately." It was like the floor disappeared beneath Jalen's feet. His mouth opened. but no sound came. His legs buckled slightly. Melanie rushed forward before the officer stopped her. "Jalen!" she cried. "No, you can't take him!" "I love you, Mom," he choked as the bailiffs handcuffed him. The courtroom descended into chaos. Melanie's scream echoed long after she was removed from the courtroom. The pastor tried to reason with the judge. The librarian shouted, "He was with me all night." But it didn't matter. No one heard them. No one wanted to. As Jalen was led down the hallway, the camera footage still looped silently on the courtroom screen, showing a thief who clearly wasn't him. The system had chosen blindness, and the price would be paid not just by Jalen, but by everyone who believed in the myth of justice that day. Because on that cold, heartless morning, the truth had been buried beneath a robe and a gavel. The rise of a mother on fire, Melanie's hunt for justice. Melanie Carter had never imagined her kitchen table would one day become a war room. Where there were once cereal boxes and school permission slips, now lay towers of legal documents, court transcripts, printouts of sentencing records, and half-empty coffee mugs strewn across stained notepads. The glow of her laptop never faded. It became her new sun, and her sleepless eyes had become used to its artificial light. The ticking of the clock above her sink wasn't comforting anymore. It was a countdown to how long her son, Jalen Carter, would remain behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. She'd been a school teacher for 12 years, a woman of order, schedules, and simple routines. But the day Judge Douglas Weller slammed his gavel and stole her son's future, something inside Melanie snapped, and something far more dangerous awakened. She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was a woman on fire. Melanie began with the obvious, Jalen's case file. She reread it 100 times, memorized the sequence of events, highlighted every inconsistency. But it wasn't enough to prove her son's innocence. She needed to prove a pattern, something deeper, something systematic. So she turned her focus to the man in the black robe who had sat so smugly on that bench, Judge Weller. She filed a Freedom of Information request, pretending to be a curious law student. She contacted retired clerks, found old court calendars, dug into every database she could hack her way into. And when the first box of records arrived from the courthouse archive, she didn't flinch. She pulled out the first file, opened a new spreadsheet, and began entering sentencing data, case after case, year after year. It didn't take long before the pattern emerged like blood in water. Black defendant, harsh sentence. White defendant, probation. 2 men, same charge, same age. 1 black, 1 white. The white defendant got community service. The black man, 18 months in county jail. It wasn't an outlier, it was a blueprint. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her data late one night. Her spreadsheet now had over 200 cases spanning a decade, each line a story of ruined futures and stolen dignity. She ran a formula, calculating the average sentence length by race. Her screen froze for a second as the result loaded. Black defendants received sentences 63% longer than white defendants under Judge Weller. Melanie gasped, not from surprise, she had already suspected as much, but from the weight of confirmation. This wasn't just about her son anymore. This was a systemic betrayal, orchestrated by a man the community had trusted for over 20 years. And she was going to expose it all. The next day she skipped work, printed every chart, every table, and taped them across her walls like a detective chasing a serial killer. Her living room became a crime lab, every corner marked by legal pads, sticky notes, and color-coded binders. This wasn't grief. This was battle preparation. Her phone buzzed. Another parent reaching out. Their son had also been sentenced harshly by Weller for a petty offense. Then another call, and another. Word was spreading that Melanie Carter was digging deep, and the community, once afraid, was now cautiously curious. A local librarian named Mrs. Palmer knocked on her door, trembling with a manila folder in hand. "I thought this might help," she whispered. Inside were newspaper clippings, stories of white teenagers caught shoplifting or driving under the influence, who walked free after appearing before Judge Weller. Their names, families, connections. Many had ties to city council members, law enforcement, even local donors. Melanie pinned them to the wall. "This man has been protecting his kind and punishing ours for years," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. She began cross-referencing the judge's golf outings, campaign donors, and private affiliations. The web became messier, but the narrative clearer. This wasn't just negligence. It was a quiet, calculated machine. And Melanie wasn't scared anymore. She bought a whiteboard the size of a refrigerator, wrote "Truth is the target" across the top in red marker, and mapped every detail. Names, sentences, zip codes, victim race, defendant race, outcomes. She began connecting the dots like a seasoned federal investigator. Her sister dropped by one afternoon and stopped cold in the doorway. "Mel, are you okay?" Melanie didn't answer. She pointed at the wall. "I'm building a case stronger than anything that courtroom has ever seen." Her sister stared in silence, then finally said, "You're not just fighting for Jalen anymore, are you?" "No," Melanie replied coldly. "I'm fighting for every black kid that man's ever buried in paperwork and forgot." But as her mission grew, so did the threats. One morning she found a note taped to her windshield. "Stop digging, or your son won't be the only one behind bars." Her hands clenched the note, but her spine stayed straight. She didn't report it. She taped it next to her data on the wall. Fuel for the fire. She began organizing community meetings, presenting her findings like a lawyer in court. Her voice grew sharper, more commanding. She learned to speak in terms the system respected. Statistics, precedents, ratios. The mother who once trembled when asking a school principal for a meeting now grilled city officials on judicial accountability in front of news cameras. And the media took notice. Local reporters came to interview her. Then state news. Then national outlets sent emails requesting documents. She started uploading her findings online under the name Justice Mom Truths. The post went viral. By now, Judge Weller's office knew who she was, but she didn't care. She sat in her living room, the flicker of TV news bouncing off walls covered in charts and headlines. Her phone buzzed again. Another parent thanking her, another case number forwarded for review. She looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "I'm not done, Jalen. They don't get to do this to you or anyone else." Melanie Carter, once just a single mother from the East Side, had become something else entirely. A symbol, a strategist, a relentless force of truth. She wasn't just fighting back. She was dismantling the system, brick by brick. And she was just getting started. It was a Tuesday night drenched in silence, the kind that pressed down on Melanie Carter's shoulders like an invisible weight. The only sound in the room was the mechanical hum of her laptop and the rhythmic scratching of her pen against yet another page of court data. Her living room, once filled with family dinners and homework sessions, had transformed into a fortress of evidence. Walls lined with charts, coffee cups stacked like sandbags, legal pads bleeding with ink. The war for her son's freedom had become her full-time existence. She was reviewing sentencing patterns for the 100th time when her phone vibrated sharply on the table. Unknown number, no caller ID. Her instincts screamed caution, but she answered. A deep, rushed voice came through the line, distorted as if passed through a filter. "You don't know me, but I know what you're doing, and I've seen the video." Melanie froze. Her heart skipped. "Who is this?" "I can't tell you, but there's a package coming to your door in 20 minutes. No cops, no press. Watch it, then decide if you really want to keep going." The line went dead. 20 minutes later, true to the promise, a small yellow envelope was slid beneath her front door. No label, no return address. Melanie stared at it like it might explode. Her hands were shaking. She brought it into the kitchen, slid a knife through the seal, and pulled out a single USB drive taped to a folded note. The note read, "This is the original. Not what the cops turned in. Ask yourself why." She didn't hesitate. She plugged it into her laptop, praying it wasn't malware, but knowing it wasn't. What appeared on her screen changed everything. It was surveillance footage. Crisp, clear, too clear. The angle was wide, showing the inside of Macklin's Electronics, the store where her son had allegedly committed the theft. The timestamp on the corner read September 2nd, 7:41 p.m. the exact time they said Jalen had stolen electronics from behind the counter. But the figure in the video wasn't her son, not even close. This man was shorter, stockier, and unmistakably white. He wore a red baseball cap pulled low over his face, a dark hoodie with the logo of Jefferson High School, and light-colored jeans. He moved with practiced confidence, not like someone scared or panicking, but like someone who knew the cameras wouldn't matter. Melanie's mouth fell open as the suspect reached behind the register and filled his backpack with Bluetooth speakers and headphones. He even looked up at the camera once, arrogantly, as if daring someone to stop him. The freeze frame captured his face for just a second, but it was enough. Enough for Melanie to know exactly who he was. Tommy Brandt. She hadn't seen him in years, but she remembered that smirk, the smirk that had taunted Jalen back in middle school. The same Tommy whose father, Councilman Richard Brandt, sat on the city planning committee and was well known for his tough-on-crime stance. As long as it wasn't his own kid in the crosshairs. Her stomach churned. Her son had been thrown into a cell, torn from his future, while the real thief walked free because of a name, a network, and a father with friends in high places. Melanie leaned back in her chair, pulse pounding. The implications hit her like a freight train. The grainy, low-resolution footage that the prosecution had submitted in court was a doctored version, deliberately fuzzy, making the thief's identity unrecognizable. Someone had covered for Tommy, someone high up. She stared at the video again, her hands clenched, her jaw locked. They didn't just ignore the truth, they buried it. And they were counting on her to stay buried too. But Melanie Carter didn't know how to stay down. She launched into motion. First, she copied the file, twice. One to her encrypted cloud storage, one onto a second drive for backup. Then she took screenshots, labeled the timeline, and created a side-by-side comparison between the original blurry footage used in court and this new damning evidence. Then she opened Twitter. Her fingers were fire on the keyboard. Breaking. This is the real footage of the Macklin's electronics theft. The boy in this video is not my son, Jalen Carter. My son was in the library at the time, proven by multiple witnesses. The real thief, Tommy Brandt, son of Councilman Richard Brandt. Watch, retweet. She uploaded the video, attached the comparison stills, then she hit post and waited. 10 minutes later, 200 views. 30 minutes later, 12,000. By the end of the first hour, justice for Jalen was trending in 4 states. People were outraged, not just angry, furious. This is corruption in plain sight, one user wrote. If this was my son, I'd burn the courthouse down, said another. Expose them all. Every last one, read the third. The story was spreading like wildfire. News outlets began tagging her. Emails poured in from journalists, advocacy groups, lawyers, civil rights activists offered support. And just as quickly, the pushback began. Her phone rang. Unknown number again. I warned you, the same voice muttered before hanging up. An hour later, her Wi-Fi went out. 2 hours later, a black SUV parked across the street. Didn't leave. But Melanie, she didn't care anymore. She wasn't hiding. She stepped onto her porch, camera in hand, and filmed the car. Uploaded that too. They're watching me, but I'm not afraid. I have the truth. You can't scare me into silence. My son deserves freedom, and you don't get to bury that. The post hit 2 million views by midnight. The next morning, Good Morning America called. By noon, CNN was broadcasting the video. By evening, the district attorney's office had released a statement saying they were reviewing new evidence in the Carter case. But Melanie knew what that really meant. They were scrambling. Jalen called her from the detention center later that night. His voice was tired, small, but for the first time in weeks, it held a spark of hope. I heard about the video, he whispered. People are talking about it in here. The guards are nervous. Melanie laughed through tears. Baby, the world's watching now. We're not alone anymore. Across town, in the mayor's private office, Councilman Brandt slammed his fist against the desk. She was never supposed to get that footage, he barked. Who leaked it? Nobody answered, because it didn't matter anymore. The lie had cracked, and the truth was flooding in. Melanie sat in her living room, surrounded by chaos, papers everywhere, phone buzzing nonstop, laptop overheating. But her eyes were fixed on the TV screen, where her son's name was now being spoken with reverence, not suspicion. The face of the red hat thief appeared beside Councilman Brandt's campaign photo. The hypocrisy was no longer hidden. The dam had burst. And Melanie Carter? She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was a national symbol of what happens when truth meets unshakable determination. And nothing, not a judge, not a politician, not even an entire corrupt system, was going to stop her now. While the city reeled from the shocking footage Melanie released, another storm was quietly brewing, this time from within the judge's own household. It began as a harmless assignment, a term paper for her criminal justice statistics class, nothing more than another requirement on the long, grueling road to her law degree. Isabella Weller, 20 years old, ambitious, top of her class at Halstead Law School, thought it would be an easy topic. Analyze judicial sentencing trends using real court data. She had access, after all. Her father, Judge Douglas Weller, had served on the bench for over 2 decades. Revered, respected, untouchable. At least that's what she used to believe. She sat in the dim light of the law school library, her fingers dancing over the keyboard as she pulled archived sentencing data from the state's public record system. She had expected to find consistency, logic, and a model of fairness, an affirmation of everything her father had taught her about justice growing up. Instead, what she uncovered felt like watching a fault line crack open beneath her feet. At first, the discrepancies were subtle. A few cases here and there, similar crimes, vastly different sentences. But as she went deeper, filtering by race, age, and socioeconomic background, an unmistakable pattern emerged. She double-checked, triple-checked, pulled more records, then cross-referenced with federal sentencing guidelines. And when the final spreadsheet loaded on her screen, she felt like throwing up. Black defendants under her father's jurisdiction had received sentences on average 62% longer than white defendants for the same offenses over the past 10 years. The pattern wasn't an outlier, it was a system built by the man who had once tucked her into bed, whispering stories about integrity and fairness. A system presided over by her father. Isabella stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop, her entire body numb. Her hand slowly moved to the folder labeled Carter Jalen. She clicked it open. A chill ran down her spine. She remembered the case, everyone did. A 17-year-old honor student sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention despite video evidence and multiple alibis. Her father had barely looked up before slamming the gavel. Her throat tightened. She thought back to the courtroom that day. She had watched from the gallery, confused by her father's cold demeanor. She had chalked it up to protocol, but now she knew the truth. He knew what he was doing. She closed the laptop, sat back in her chair, and stared at the ceiling. Her mind raced, images flashing like lightning strikes. Her father giving interviews about justice reform, shaking hands with city officials, laughing at dinner as if he weren't silently destroying lives from behind the bench. And suddenly, the house she had grown up in didn't feel like home. It felt like a crime scene. That night, Isabella drove home with her heart pounding. She clutched the printed data in her bag like it was radioactive. The Weller home sat behind tall iron gates, warm light glowing through the windows. A portrait of her father hung in the entryway, robed and proud. But as she stepped inside, it seemed to glare at her like a warning. She found him in the study, surrounded by law books, sipping brandy. "Dad," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I need to talk to you." Judge Weller looked up, smiling. "My little crusader, how's that paper going?" She set the folder down on his desk. "Read it." He raised an eyebrow, opening the pages. The smile slowly faded. He flipped page after page, eyes narrowing as the data punched through his composure like bullets. "What is this?" he muttered. "Your cases," she said. "Your decisions. 10 years worth. The numbers don't lie." He slammed the folder shut. "This is cherry-picked. You don't understand the context." Isabella's voice rose. "I understand exactly what this means. You sent Jalen Carter to detention for 2 years based on a crime he didn't commit. There were witnesses, video evidence. He had an alibi. And he's not the only one. There are dozens more. You're speaking from emotion, not reason, he snapped. The world isn't as black and white as your classroom wants it to be. No, she fired back, eyes burning. But your courtroom is. The air turned electric. Her mother, Patricia, appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. Isabella, what's going on? I found proof, she said, her voice breaking. He's been handing down longer sentences to Black and Latino defendants for years. It's all in there. Patricia looked at her husband, unsure, eyes flickering with fear. Judge Weller stood up, towering. You will not bring this filth into my house. You're my daughter. You owe me respect. I owe the truth more than I owe you, Isabella said coldly. I'm going to report this. You'll destroy me, he growled. She held his gaze. You already destroyed yourself. I'm just refusing to cover it up. His face twisted with something between fury and fear. If you go public with this, don't expect another cent for law school. Don't expect anything from this family. A long silence. Then Isabella slowly picked up her folder and bag. I don't need your money, she whispered. I need to sleep at night. She walked out the front door and didn't look back. 3 days later, her story broke. Isabella sat on the set of a local news station, dressed in a plain black blazer, her hands visibly trembling. The host introduced her as the daughter of a longtime judge, now turned whistleblower. The footage of Jalen Carter played on the monitor beside them. She stared at it, fury and sorrow tightening her chest. We have with us Isabella Weller, the anchor said, law student, advocate, and today one of the most courageous voices in this city's justice system. Isabella, tell us what you found. She took a breath. The data doesn't lie. My father's rulings consistently punish people of color more harshly than white defendants. In dozens of cases, young black men were given excessive sentences for nonviolent crimes, while white defendants with similar records walked free. This wasn't coincidence. It was systemic. It was intentional. And it must be exposed. The interview went viral overnight. The internet exploded. Hashtags erupted, Daughter for Justice Weller, Bias Exposed Justice. For Jalen, some called her a hero. Others called her a traitor. Her law school was flooded with interview requests. Civil rights groups reached out with offers to support her. But there were threats too. Emails, anonymous voicemails. Keep your mouth shut or you'll regret it. She ignored them all. Within 72 hours, she was standing in front of the State Judicial Review Board, testifying under oath. Her documents, data, and personal testimony were entered into official record. Cameras waited outside. Protesters lined the courthouse steps. And for the first time, Judge Douglas Weller's name wasn't spoken with reverence. It was spoken with scrutiny. And Isabella, the daughter who once idolized him, had become the catalyst for his fall. At home that evening, she sat alone in her apartment, the air thick with silence. Her phone buzzed with messages, praise, encouragement, invitations to speak. But all she could think of was the boy in the footage, Jalen Carter, still sitting in a detention center for a crime he didn't commit. She picked up her phone and dialed a journalist who had contacted her earlier in the day. I'm ready to go national, she said. Are you sure? He asked. This could get dangerous. She looked around her tiny apartment, thinking of the home she'd left behind, the man who now saw her as an enemy. I'm already in it, she replied. And if I stop now, then everything I did was for nothing. Jalen deserves better. They all do. The reporter didn't hesitate. Let's make it happen. That night, Isabella sent him the complete file. Every case, every number, every name. The truth laid bare for the world to see. She wasn't doing it for revenge. She wasn't doing it for fame. She was doing it because justice had a price, and she was finally willing to pay it, even if it cost her everything. The video had gone viral. The data was undeniable. The city buzzed with outrage, and protesters lined courthouse steps with signs reading, "Free Jalen now," and "Truth can't be silenced." News anchors debated the scandal nightly. Influencers, attorneys, activists, everyone had picked a side. And for once, it felt like justice might actually break through the cracks. But inside the walls of the courthouse, those cracks were being sealed shut with concrete. Melanie Carter stood in front of the clerk's desk, clutching a thick folder filled with new evidence. the high-resolution footage, sworn affidavits, and the statistical analysis that revealed a decade-long pattern of racial bias. The clerk didn't even meet her eyes as he stamped the top page, "Received." "Now what?" Melanie asked, voice taut. "We'll review it in due time," he said without emotion. Due time. As if her son wasn't sitting behind locked doors for a crime he didn't commit. As if every day didn't chip away at his mind, his future, his belief in a world that claimed to protect the innocent. She stormed out, her heels echoing through the marble hallway like gunshots, fury blazing behind her eyes. 2 days later, the response came. Motion for retrial, denied. The words blinked on her screen like a slap to the face. No explanation, no hearing, no acknowledgement of the new footage, the media firestorm, the public outcry, nothing. Just one word as cold and final as a coffin lid. Melanie collapsed into her chair, the air sucked from her lungs. She had done everything right. Gathered proof, built momentum, dragged the truth into the light. And still the system shrugged, because the system wasn't broken. It was built this way. At the detention center, Jalen sat in the corner of the common room, staring blankly at the TV while a segment about his case played silently in the background. Other boys watched with curiosity. Some patted his back, called him famous, but Jalen didn't smile. He didn't feel famous. He felt forgotten. When his mother visited that weekend, she tried to stay strong, but Jalen saw it in her face. The weariness, the rage, the creeping hopelessness. "They said no," she whispered. He didn't respond, just looked down at his hands, wrists scarred from cold metal cuffs. "It doesn't matter," he said flatly. "Yes, it does," she snapped, grabbing his hand. "You matter. They're scared, Jalen. That's why they're stonewalling us, because they know we're right." Jalen stared at her, something flickering in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but fire. Melanie left that day knowing one thing for certain: they had declared war on truth, and she was done asking for permission to fight back. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The phone rang at 2:13 a.m. Melanie Carter jolted upright in bed, heart pounding. The room was pitch black, her breath visible in the cold air. She fumbled for the phone on her nightstand, blinking at the unknown number on the screen. Her instincts screamed, "Don't answer," but her heart, wired to every movement of her son's case, wouldn't allow silence. "Hello?" Her voice cracked from sleep and fear. A pause, then a low, distorted voice crawled through the receiver like venom. "You think you're helping your boy, but if you don't back off, you're going to lose more than just your sleep. Accidents happen, files go missing. People do too." Click. The dial tone screamed in her ear. She sat frozen for several seconds, the phone trembling in her hand. Then, without thinking, she bolted out of bed, grabbed a notepad and scribbled down the time, the voice, the threat. Her mind raced, adrenaline pumping. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a warning. They were watching her, tracking her. They knew she was getting too close, and they were willing to silence her, by any means necessary. The next morning, she tried to file a report with the local police. The officer at the desk didn't even take out a pen. "Do you have the number?" he asked with a smirk. "No," she snapped. "It was blocked." He shrugged. "Then there's nothing we can do. Could have been a prank." "It wasn't a goddamn prank," she hissed. "My son is sitting in juvie for a crime he didn't commit, and someone just threatened my life." The officer leaned back, unconcerned. "Then maybe you should stop stirring things up." Melanie stared at him, rage boiling under her skin. That was the moment she realized. The police weren't going to help. They were part of the system protecting the lie. That same afternoon, she learned that Jalen had been placed in solitary confinement. Administrative separation, they called it. No explanation, no warning, just a 2-sentence update buried in a weekly status report. Her hands shook as she read the line. "Inmate Carter transferred to restricted housing pending review." She called the detention center, demanded answers. The woman on the phone was cold, robotic. It's for his safety, she said. From what? Melanie demanded. We're not authorized to discuss that. Her knees buckled as she hung up. She sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by court documents and case files, trying not to scream. Her son, the boy who'd never been in trouble a day in his life, was now locked in a concrete box with no contact, no light, and no explanation. And no one cared. Desperate, she contacted attorney Gene Bradshaw, a high-powered civil rights lawyer with a reputation for going after dirty judges. He'd once taken on the police union in a corruption case and won. If anyone could shake the foundation of this case, it was him. She met him at a sleek office in the city, her folder of evidence clutched to her chest like a life vest. Bradshaw skimmed through the documents, his brow furrowed with growing concern. This is solid, he said finally. Really solid. So you'll take the case? He hesitated, sat back. The temperature in the room dropped. Mrs. Carter, he said slowly, you need to understand something. Judge Weller isn't just any judge. He plays golf with 3 members of the ethics board. His brother-in-law sits on the state bar committee. His daughter may have exposed him, but his friends still protect him. She narrowed her eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying, he exhaled, if I take this case, I won't just be going up against a broken system. I'll be going up against a political machine. And I've got 2 daughters, a law firm, and about 5 clients already warning me to stay away from this mess. You're scared, she said, almost in disbelief. I'm cautious, he replied. You should be too. So you're turning me down? I'm telling you to be careful. You're fighting something bigger than you can see. And if you're not prepared to lose everything, your job, your home, maybe your life, then you need to walk away now. Melanie stood, her chair scraping back like thunder. She stared at him with the kind of fury only a mother could possess. My son is already losing everything, she said through clenched teeth. So what the hell do I have left to lose? She left the office without another word. But when she reached the street, the strength began to crack. Her legs felt heavy, her throat tight. The tears came fast, hot, and relentless. She wandered the streets like a ghost, past strangers, traffic, storefronts glowing with holiday lights, a world that kept spinning while hers was crumbling. Back home, she collapsed on the couch, unable to move, her body numb, her mind exhausted. The evidence, the protests, the headlines, none of it mattered anymore. Not to the judge, not to the courts, not to the so-called protectors of justice. The machine was swallowing her, grinding her down with bureaucracy and indifference. And now, her son was alone, locked in a room, cold and isolated, because his mother had fought too hard. She stared at the ceiling, her chest hollow. For the first time since this nightmare began, Melanie Carter felt like giving up. She stopped answering calls. Let the laundry pile up. Forgot to eat. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of Jalen. The science fair medals, the basketball trophy, the framed honor roll certificate. All of them now felt like taunts from a past life. A life that had been ripped away the moment Judge Weller dropped that gavel. She couldn't sleep. When she did, she dreamed of her son pounding on the walls of solitary, screaming for help no one could hear. One morning after 3 sleepless nights, she stood in the shower, water running ice cold, and whispered, I can't do this anymore. And for a moment she believed it. For a moment the idea of silence felt merciful, of disappearing, letting the world continue its twisted dance without her in it. Maybe then they'd leave Jalen alone. Maybe the system would forget him, and that would somehow be safer. She slid down the tiled wall, water pouring over her as she sat curled beneath the faucet, sobbing like a woman whose soul had been set on fire and left to burn alone. But somewhere, beneath the grief, beneath the fear, there was a spark, a tiny ember refusing to go out. Jalen's voice echoed in her memory. You matter, Mom. You never stop fighting. That's who you are. And she remembered his face the last time she saw him, hollow-eyed but still trying to be brave, still clinging to her strength like a lifeline. That spark caught. Melanie took a deep breath and opened her eyes. Not today, not yet. They hadn't won, and as long as she had breath, they never would. Isabella Weller sat alone in her apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting long shadows across her face. Sleep had become a stranger, unwelcome, unnecessary. Her inbox was overflowing with messages. Journalists, lawyers, students, strangers. People who had read her statement, seen her interviews, or stumbled across the massive spreadsheet she'd released, documenting her father's biased sentencing record. Each message carried pain. Each one carried a name. Each one begged for help. But there were too many stories for one person to carry. So she picked up her phone and called in reinforcements. The first call went to the Equal Justice Foundation, a nonprofit known for exposing racial injustice in the courts. The woman who answered, Monica Graves, recognized Isabella immediately. "We've been following your story," Monica said, "and your courage." "I need more than recognition," Isabella replied, voice steady despite the weight behind it. "I need a platform, a loud one." "You've got it," Monica said without hesitation. Within 24 hours, Isabella was sitting in a secure Zoom call with a team of attorneys, analysts, and policy experts. She sent them everything, every file, every case, every name she had uncovered in her investigation. When the call ended, one of the lawyers whispered, "This isn't just damning, it's systemic." The second call was riskier, but necessary. The New York Ledger, national coverage, massive reach. She contacted their senior justice correspondent, Alan Reyes, a man with a reputation for going after giants and never blinking. He didn't blink now. "We're going to break this wide open," Alan said, "if you're ready for what's coming." "I've already lost my father," Isabella replied. "What else is there to lose?" Alan worked fast. By the end of the week, a 6-part investigative series dropped on the Ledger's homepage with the headline, "The Black Robe Bias, One Judge, Decades of Injustice." The article hit like a bomb. The first installment followed the story of Jalen Carter, from honor roll student to wrongful imprisonment. It featured interviews with Melanie, civil rights advocates, and the librarians who had testified on Jalen's behalf. Side-by-side images showed the real thief in the red cap next to Jalen's school photo, proof of how far the justice system had contorted itself to protect the powerful and punish the innocent. The second article dug into Weller's court records, hundreds of them, highlighting cases where Black and Latino youth received double, even triple the sentencing of white counterparts for identical charges. By the time the third article hit, the internet was on fire. Weller exposed justice. For Jalen, how many more social media exploded? TikToks were made, memes circulated, protest groups mobilized. Activists started flooding the steps of the county courthouse, chanting Jalen's name alongside others who'd been silenced by a biased bench. And it didn't stop there. Other victims began speaking out, one by one, anonymous emails, handwritten letters, tear-filled Zoom calls, parents, siblings, children now grown. "I was sentenced to 18 months for shoplifting a phone case. My brother got 5 years for possession. His white friend walked free. My son died in lockup. Weller said he needed to learn respect." Each voice was another Domi. Each name a blow to the gavel that had once ruled without question. Judge Weller could no longer hide behind the bench. 2 weeks later, a breaking news alert interrupted daytime television across the country. Judge Douglas Weller suspended from duty, pending full investigation. The footage showed the courthouse steps as reporters swarmed, demanding statements. A lone bailiff stood guard as officials cleared Weller's chambers. Inside, Isabella watched the broadcast from her apartment, heart pounding. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Her name was trending on Twitter. People were calling her the judge's daughter who broke the system. But this wasn't victory. It was just the beginning. That night, she met Melanie Carter in person for the first time. They sat together at a quiet diner, tucked in the corner, away from the cameras. Melanie looked older than she had in the interviews, tired, haunted, but her eyes still burned. "You did it," Melanie said quietly. "You took him down." "No," Isabella said, shaking her head. "We made the truth impossible to ignore." There was a pause between them, thick with unspoken grief and shared fury. Melanie finally asked, "Do you think they'll actually overturn the cases?" Isabella looked out the window, watching a group of protesters marching by, holding signs with names that spanned 2 decades. "I think they're scared now," she said, "and scared people move." Over the next few days, more articles followed. News outlets from every coast picked up the story. National networks requested interviews. Political analysts debated live on air. Legal scholars called for deeper reform. Then came the real breakthrough. The State Department of Justice announced a formal review of every sentence handed down by Judge Weller over the past 15 years. Over 400 cases. A special task force was appointed to oversee it. Their goal: identify bias, misconduct, and wrongful convictions, and make it right. Melanie received a letter the next morning. Official seal. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. It was from the state attorney's office. The final line read, "In light of newly surfaced evidence and investigative findings, the case of Jalen Carter will be reopened for immediate judicial review." She sank to her knees, sobbing, not with sorrow this time, but with something dangerously close to hope. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Weller sat alone in his house. No cameras, no bailiffs, no robes. Just silence. His once polished reputation lay in tatters. Headlines branded him a symbol of everything broken in the system. The state bar had launched an ethics inquiry. Protesters gathered outside his gate each day. His wife had left to stay with family. His phone rang constantly, but no one offered comfort. Just questions, subpoenas, and consequences. He stared at the television as the 5th installment of the Ledger series aired. On the screen was a young man, Marcus Rivera, sentenced to 4 years for a first offense of graffiti. The white teen he was arrested with had received probation. The split screen showed Weller's sentencing transcript. Cold, condescending, racially coded. The shame came in waves, but still, he hadn't apologized. Not publicly, not to Jalen, not to his daughter, not to anyone. In the final week of coverage, the New York Ledger published a special editorial titled, "What One Daughter's Courage Exposed and What We Must Do Next." It praised Isabella's integrity, highlighted Melanie's unwavering fight, and called on lawmakers to establish mandatory racial bias training for judges, plus independent review boards to monitor sentencing disparities. Public pressure mounted. Petitions soared past 1 million signatures. And at the center of it all stood 2 women, one whose son was nearly buried by a broken system, and one who had helped build it without even knowing. Their alliance became the fire the courts could no longer smother. And as the justice system, long shrouded in silence, began to tremble under the weight of truth, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just about Weller anymore. This was about every courtroom, every biased gavel, every name lost in paperwork. And now those names were being spoken aloud, one by one, louder than ever. The sky above the juvenile detention center was a pale gray, overcast and heavy, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. Outside the rusted gate, a crowd had gathered. Cameras clicked. Reporters whispered into microphones. Protesters waved handmade signs. "Justice for Jalen! Free the innocent! The system must change!" A tension crackled in the air like a storm waiting to break. Then the steel doors creaked open, and Jalen Carter stepped into the light. He moved slowly, unsure, almost as if he expected someone to yank him back at the last second. His shoulders were thinner, his eyes darker, carrying the weight of everything he'd endured. The gray detention uniform hung loose on his frame. He had outgrown it emotionally, spiritually, even physically. His hands were clenched, not from fear, but from the need to stay grounded, to remind himself this was real. For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone shouted his name. "Jalen!" The crowd erupted. Cheers broke the silence like thunder. Applause followed like rolling waves. Reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed. Microphones reached for his face. But Jalen didn't react. His eyes were locked on only one person, Melanie Carter. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, barely breathing, hands covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched her son walk toward her, slowly, carefully, like a man emerging from fire. He stopped just 3 steps away. Neither spoke. Then Melanie dropped her purse, ran to him, and wrapped her arms around his trembling body. She clung to him as if afraid he might vanish again. Jalen pressed his face into her shoulder, breathing in the smell of home. detergent and perfume, coffee and safety. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Mom." "No, baby," she whispered through tears, pulling back to touch his face. "I'm sorry. I should have never let them take you from me." The cameras caught it all, the raw emotion, the reunion that should have never had to happen, the mother and son who had been separated by injustice and reunited by truth. A reporter approached cautiously. "Jalen, do you have anything to say to the public?" Jalen turned, his face calm but his voice trembling with emotion. "I just want to go home." And that was all. Melanie led him through the crowd, shielding him like a lioness guarding her cub. She didn't care about the questions or the noise. She didn't care about the headlines. She had her son back. That was the only victory that mattered. That night, the Carter home came alive again. Jalen stood in his room, fingers brushing across familiar trophies, books, the crumpled high school hoodie he hadn't seen in months. Everything looked the same, but he had changed. The boy who once dreamed of college and community service had been swallowed by the justice system and spit out harder, sharper, forged in fire. He sat on the bed, head in his hands, when a soft knock came at the door. Melanie opened it just a little, peeking in. "There's someone here to see you." Jalen looked up, wary. A moment later, Isabella Weller stepped into the room. She looked smaller than she had on television, her suit replaced by a simple jacket, her hair pulled back. Her eyes were tired but steady, and her hands clutched a folder like a shield. Jalen stood, silent, unmoving. "Hi," she said softly. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say this face to face." Melanie stood in the doorway, watching with the careful eye of a mother who had learned not to trust too easily. Isabella took a step forward. "My father did this to you, and I didn't know. I should have, but I didn't. When I found out, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't breathe. I knew I had to speak up, even if it meant destroying my family." She held out the folder. "I documented every case he ever ruled on. I made sure the review board saw it. You weren't just a mistake. You were part of a pattern. And now, that pattern is broken." Jalen took the folder but didn't look at it. He stared at her for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "I thought I'd die in there." Isabella swallowed hard. "I know. They made me feel like nothing, like my life didn't matter." "It does," she said, "more than ever." There was silence. Then Jalen extended a hand. She shook it. No forgiveness was spoken, but something shifted. A bridge built not from peace, but from understanding. 3 days later, the Carter phone rang again. This time, it was the National Legal Justice Initiative. A woman named Diane Mercer introduced herself, her voice clear and confident. "We followed Jalen's case from the beginning. It has ignited a national conversation about systemic bias. We'd like to invite Jalen to become an ambassador for our youth justice program." Melanie raised an eyebrow. "An ambassador?" "He'd speak at schools, advocacy groups, maybe even Congress. Share his story, help change the system from the inside." Melanie looked at Jalen, who had been listening nearby. He didn't react, just stared out the window, lost in thought. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Diane replied, "but we think your voice could change lives." After the call ended, Melanie sat beside her son. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Jalen nodded slowly. "I'm not sure if I am." She took his hand. "But if you are," she said, "you won't be doing it alone." That night, Jalen sat at his desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He picked up a pen, wrote the words, "I was 17 when the system tried to erase me, but I'm still here." The beginning of something new, not revenge, redemption, and maybe, just maybe, revolution. 5 years had passed since Jalen Carter stepped out of the juvenile detention center, the cameras flashing in his face, the cheers of protesters ringing in his ears, his mother's arms wrapped around him like a shield against the world. But time hadn't dulled the memory, it had sharpened it. Every second of his wrongful imprisonment was etched into him like a scar. It didn't fade, it fueled him. Now at 22, Jalen walked the polished halls of Colton State Law School, head held high, casebooks under one arm, his voice known across campus not just as a student, but as a survivor, a leader, and an architect of change. His past was no longer a burden, it was his weapon. The lecture halls knew his name. So did Washington. Because Jalen hadn't just survived the system, he had decided to dismantle it brick by brick from the inside out. And he wasn't doing it alone. Across the city in a sunlit office overlooking the courthouse that once tried to bury him, the doors to Justice Horizon swung open. Inside, desks buzzed with activity. Interns, paralegals, law students, and policy researchers filled the room. Diverse faces from every background, all drawn by the same mission: to expose injustice, defend the unheard, and rewrite the rules that protected power over people. And at the heart of it all, Jalen Carter and Isabella Weller. Once on opposite sides of a courtroom, one the victim of a corrupt system, the other the daughter of the man who symbolized it, they now stood side by side as co-founders of a movement that had swept the nation. Justice Horizon wasn't a nonprofit in name only. It was a war room. They took on wrongful convictions, racial bias in sentencing, juvenile incarceration reform, and judicial accountability. They trained young lawyers not just in the law, but in the courage to challenge it. Jalen's office was simple but symbolic. A framed photo of him and Melanie sat on the desk. The wall behind bore the original newspaper clipping, "Judge suspended after daughter exposes racial bias." Next to it, a second frame held a quote in bold block letters: "The system isn't broken. It was built this way. We're here to build something new." He sat at the desk that afternoon, reviewing a case involving a 15-year-old sentenced as an adult. The same nightmare. Different name. He circled passages in red, highlighting the same racial disparities he once lived. Just then, Isabella knocked once and stepped in. She looked different now, older, sharper, with the same fire in her eyes that had led her to betray the silence of her family name. "Congressional Subcommittee confirmed," she said, holding up her phone. "You're testifying next month." Jalen blinked, surprised. "That fast?" "You're too loud to ignore," she said, smirking. "Even Capitol Hill's paying attention." He stood, walked over to the window. Outside, the skyline shimmered in the early spring sun. He remembered pacing in a 6x8 cell, wondering if he'd ever see sunlight through a window without bars. "I'm ready," he said. Isabella studied him for a moment. "You're not the same kid they locked up." Jalen nodded. "But they taught me exactly what to fight." The door burst open then, an intern waving a folder. "We've got another one," she said breathlessly. 14-year-old, same county, sentenced by a new judge. And guess what? The DA's office tried to bury the video footage. Jalen's face hardened. "Get their name. We'll take it." They weren't just fixing old cases anymore. They were stopping new ones from ever happening. Across the office, phones rang. Legal briefs flew across desks. Advocacy videos were edited. Op-eds published. Data reports finalized. Justice Horizon had grown from two people into a movement. And everywhere Jalen and Isabella went, schools, law conferences, community centers, they carried a message the system couldn't ignore anymore. Justice must be rebuilt, not rebranded. 5 years ago, they'd been two young people crushed by the weight of one man's gavel. Now they held the megaphone, and they weren't putting it down. The name Douglas Weller once struck fear, reverence, and silent obedience throughout the Oak Ridge County Courthouse. His gavel had the weight of finality, and his bench was a throne no one dared challenge. But that was years ago. Now the man once feared as an unflinching enforcer of law and order walked quietly onto a small community college stage in rural Pennsylvania, wearing no robe, no badge, and no illusion of righteousness. Gray had overtaken his hair. His posture, once proud and commanding, now sloped under the burden of years spent confronting his past. He cleared his throat and faced the modest crowd gathered for his presentation. "Bias in the courtroom, how I learned to listen too late." He didn't pretend anymore. "I was wrong," Weller began, his voice slow but steady. "For 25 years, I sat on the bench believing I was delivering justice. What I delivered instead was harm rooted in bias I never acknowledged, until it was too late." The students watched, some skeptical, some curious. He paused and looked down at his notes, but he didn't read from them. There was a boy named Jalen Carter, 17, an honor student, accused of theft. Every shred of evidence proved his innocence. I saw it, and I ignored it. Because he didn't look right to me. Because I assumed what I should have questioned. A hush fell across the room. I sentenced him to 2 years. I robbed him of his youth, his future. And when I walked out of that courtroom, I told myself I had done my job. But I hadn't done justice. I had done damage. There was no applause, no admiration, just silence. And that was how Judge Douglas Weller preferred it. Because redemption, he had learned, was not something you were owed. It was something you worked for, even if you could never fully earn it. He now spent his days speaking at schools, civic halls, even police academies, using his own failure as a case study in the urgency of judicial humility and systemic reform. He never asked for sympathy. He only asked that his mistakes be turned into momentum. Meanwhile, far from that small stage in a gleaming conference center in Washington, D.C., thousands of the nation's top legal minds, scholars, activists, and lawmakers filled the National Hall for the annual Justice Reform Summit. Cameras were everywhere. Every word spoken here would ripple across policy, politics, and public discourse. And at the center of the agenda, two names now synonymous with the fight for transformation: Jalen Carter and Isabella Weller. Their organization, Justice Horizon, had grown beyond its founders. Chapters now operated in 26 states. Their work had influenced legislation in 5. But this was something bigger, a moment 5 years in the making. The announcer's voice echoed through the auditorium. Please welcome co-founders of Justice Horizon, advocates and survivors of systemic injustice, Jalen Carter and Isabella Weller. Thunderous applause. Jalen stepped up first, wearing a tailored Navy suit, his stance grounded, calm, commanding. But his eyes held the fire of someone who had been to hell and clawed his way back with truth in both hands. He scanned the room. I was 17 when the justice system decided I didn't matter, he began. They had the footage, the witnesses, the truth. But it wasn't enough, because truth wasn't what they were trained to see. They saw my skin first, and everything else last. The room was silent now, focused. I sat in a concrete cell for a crime I didn't commit while the real thief walked free, because his father had power and I had none. My mother fought like hell to save me, and when she got too close to the truth, they locked me in solitary. He paused, letting the tension hang like a storm cloud. 5 years later, I stand here not just as a law student, not just as a survivor, but as someone determined to make sure no child ever has to endure what I did. Applause roared again. Then Jalen turned toward Isabella, who now stood beside him at the podium, the daughter of the judge who had once destroyed his life, now his partner in rebuilding the world that nearly broke them both. Isabella stepped forward. When I discovered the truth about my father's courtroom, she said, voice clear and fierce, I had 2 choices: protect his legacy or protect the lives his rulings destroyed. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze unwavering. I chose the truth, and it cost me my family, my home, everything familiar. But it gave me something more important, a cause worth burning for. Behind them, a massive screen lit up, showing the title of their joint policy proposal: Justice Accountability, Sentencing Parity, and Equity Reform. Isabella continued, pointing to the screen. We're here to propose national-level reform that ensures no judge, no courtroom, and no case ever gets buried under bias again. Jalen took over. The Jasper Act includes 5 pillars, he explained. Mandatory racial bias training for all judges, real-time sentence disparity tracking by independent oversight bodies, public access to judicial statistics, federal oversight of juvenile sentencing practices, and a whistleblower protection clause for court staff and attorneys who expose discrimination. Applause again, louder this time. Justice can't depend on who your father is, Isabella added. It can't hinge on the zip code you're born into, the color of your skin, or the school you attend. It must be blind, but also aware. They concluded together. We don't want to reform the system just to make it more palatable. We want to rebuild it, to finally make it just. The entire hall rose to their feet, thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. As they stepped down from the stage, dozens rushed to greet them, lawmakers, journalists, students who had followed their journey from the very beginning. But just as the wave of congratulations swelled around them, a quiet figure approached from the side of the room. Douglas Weller. No camera followed him. No microphone caught his breath. He walked slowly, hands trembling slightly, until he stood in front of Jalen and Isabella. Jalen turned. They locked eyes. No hatred, just wait. "I watched your speech," Weller said softly, "and I want you to know. I hear you now. I didn't before, but I do now." Jalen didn't speak. Not yet. Isabella looked at her father, aged, unarmed, no longer a symbol of authority, but a man who had been shattered by his own silence. Then Jalen extended his hand, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement, a gesture that said, "You can't undo what you've done, but you can help make sure it never happens again." Weller shook it, and then quietly slipped away, lost in the crowd, but no longer hiding. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Judge sides with white cops in court until the black man reveals he's a U.S. attorney. The courtroom was a tomb. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as the crowd shifted in uneasy silence. The wooden benches groaned beneath the weight of bodies too tense to move. And at the front of it all, under the cold, indifferent glare of justice, stood Elijah Hayes, 16 years old, wrists bound in steel cuffs too tight for a child's skin. His breathing was shallow. His eyes darted across the room, searching for something, anything that made sense. But the courtroom offered none. Defendant Elijah Hayes is charged with aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer. The bailiff read, his voice robotic like he was reciting the weather. Case number 21-134, presiding, Judge Sharon Whitmore. The judge didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even look up from her files. She simply said, "Proceed." And just like that, a boy was on trial for his life. Elijah had no history of violence, no weapon, no prior record. What he did have was melanin in his skin and the nerve to ask a cop, "Why are you following me?" That was it. One question, one look. And now Elijah was facing years behind bars for lunging at an officer, a charge that had been rubber-stamped within hours of his arrest and fast-tracked through a system that never once asked if the story made sense. In the gallery, Malcolm Hayes sat frozen, his hands clenched so tight they'd gone pale at the knuckles. He wasn't a man easily shaken. He'd worked with the Justice Department for 20 years. But this wasn't work. This was his son. And he was watching him drown in a courtroom where no one was even pretending to care. The prosecutor was already on his feet, a young man in a crisp navy suit, eyes sharp, voice smoother than it should have been for the stakes involved. "Your Honor," he said with performative concern, "the state will show that the defendant behaved in an erratic and hostile manner, placing Officer Kevin Rourke in a position of imminent danger." There it was. Imminent danger. The phrase that let a man shoot, strike, or shackle a black teenager and still sleep soundly at night. Malcolm's jaw tightened. No video had been presented. No body cam footage. No civilian testimony. Just one officer's word, and it was enough. Elijah stood beside his public defender, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days and hadn't read the case file in 4. The man leaned toward Elijah, whispered something, and Elijah nodded, his lips trembling as he tried to swallow his fear. The courtroom had already made up its mind. Judge Whitmore finally looked up. Her gaze was glacier cold as it swept across the room, landing briefly on Elijah before flicking away, like even eye contact was too generous. "Does the defense have an opening statement?" she asked, with the same tone someone might use to order a coffee. The lawyer stood awkwardly. "Your Honor, my client," but he didn't get to finish. The prosecutor cut in. "Objection. Defense counsel is referencing material not yet entered into evidence." "Objection sustained," Whitmore snapped before the lawyer could even respond. Malcolm couldn't take it. He stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the hush like a thunderclap, "my son is 16. He asked why he was being followed. That's not a crime. Every head turned. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Sir, if you speak again without permission, I will have you removed from this courtroom. Malcolm didn't back down. This entire process is wrong. There's no evidence. No due process. You're treating him like he's already guilty. Bailiff, she said. The word was a command. One of the guards moved toward Malcolm, heavy boots thudding like a threat across the polished floor. For a split second, time froze. You could feel the tension clinging to the air like smoke after an explosion. Malcolm raised his hands, not in surrender, but in warning. I'm not here to start a scene, he said, his voice steady now, deep, thunderous. But I will not sit quietly while you destroy my son for something he didn't do. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, but he was louder than anyone in the room. And that was the problem, because the courtroom wasn't built to hear voices like his. Not when they were calm, not when they were right, only when they were broken. The bailiff stopped inches away from him, waiting for a nod from the judge. It never came. She stared at Malcolm like she was daring him to go further, like she wanted him to explode so she could justify dismissing him altogether. Malcolm didn't move, didn't blink. He just sat back down, slowly, deliberately, eyes locked on his son. No one in that courtroom knew who he really was. They didn't know about the degrees, the federal courtroom victories, the policy memos with his name on the bottom. All they saw was a black man too angry, too loud, too close to the truth. The words dropped like a guillotine. 5 years in juvenile detention. The judge's voice was flat, unmoved, as if she'd just sentenced a number, not a child, not a life, not a 16-year-old boy whose only crime was existing while black in the wrong zip code. Elijah didn't move. He stood there, frozen, lips parted slightly like the air had just been knocked out of his chest. The cuffs on his wrists clinked softly as his hands trembled. His public defender blinked in disbelief, muttered something beneath his breath. Too little, too late. Malcolm Hayes rose halfway from his seat. His heart slammed against his rib cage like a war drum. What did you just say? He whispered, but the words were lost in the chaos unraveling around him. The bailiff moved toward Elijah. The gavel slammed once, twice, 3 times. Order in the court! There was no order. There was only outrage, only injustice, steaming and suffocating like smoke trapped under glass. Malcolm's voice finally tore through the room. You're sentencing a child based on nothing. There was no weapon, no evidence. You don't even have video. Judge Whitmore didn't even look up. Remove him! Bailiffs turned. Malcolm didn't care. He didn't back down. This is a farce. A legal execution dressed in robes and polite language. Elijah looked at his father as the guards took his arm. His eyes were wide, panicked, pleading, not just for help, but for understanding, for someone to explain how the world flipped upside down in less than 10 minutes. I didn't do anything, he said, voice cracking. Dad, I swear, I just asked him why. I know, Malcolm said, stepping forward before the guards could stop him. I know, son. You did nothing wrong. His voice was soft now, but that softness carried more rage than a scream. The courtroom had already moved on. The judge was gathering her papers. The prosecutor was shaking hands with Officer Rourke, both of them smug, satisfied, like this was just another win. Just another black boy taken off the streets. Just another case closed. But it wasn't over. Not for Malcolm, not for Elijah. Because in that moment, standing in a courtroom where the scales of justice were rusted and rotting, Malcolm made a silent vow. They will regret this. The hallway smelled like bleach, sweat, and something sour that clung to the air like guilt. Cold white lights flickered overhead, humming above chipped linoleum floors that had seen too many broken promises and too many forgotten children. Each step Malcolm Hayes took echoed with dread. He hadn't worn a suit. Today he wasn't a senior federal advisor. He wasn't a man who had drafted federal civil rights legislation or spoken before the Justice Committee in D.C. He was just a father, and his son was on the other side of the glass. The guard didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. We know who runs this place, and it's not you. Malcolm sat down at the steel chair in front of the reinforced partition. The cold surface sent a shiver through him, but it wasn't the metal. It was the silence that followed. Then a door opened across the glass. The clank of chains, the soft shuffle of shackled feet. And there he was, Elijah, his boy, 16, eyes sunken. A fresh bruise bloomed along his cheekbone, deep purple under fluorescent light. His lip was split. His posture, usually upright, proud, was collapsed, folded into himself like he didn't know where to hide. When he saw his father, he paused for just a moment, shame flickering in his gaze, before sitting down slowly. The phone receiver crackled as Malcolm picked it up. He watched Elijah hesitate, then lift his own. They sat in silence, just breathing for a moment. Then Elijah's voice came through, small, hoarse. "Dad," he whispered, "what did I do wrong?" The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he did. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, swallowing the knot rising in his throat. "You asked a question. You used your voice. But they said I threatened him, that I charged at him." "Elijah," Malcolm's voice was firmer now. "You didn't. I know you. I know your heart." Elijah leaned forward, confusion etched deep into his young face. "Then why am I here?" "Because you're black. Because the system is broken. Because power fears truth. And you didn't lower your eyes." But Malcolm didn't say that. Not yet. Instead, he said, "Because the world still doesn't know how to see you for who you are." Elijah looked down. "They said I was aggressive, but I wasn't. I was scared." "I know," his father's voice cracked. "I know, son." They sat like that for a while, two figures divided by plexiglass and by a country that had promised liberty but delivered chains. Elijah told him about the guards, about the nights with the lights left on, about the food that made him sick, about the other boys, some older, some smaller, who kept to themselves or lashed out in fear. There were no second chances in here, no mercy, just time and the slow erosion of hope. "I don't belong here," Elijah said, "but I don't think anyone else does either." Malcolm wanted to scream. He wanted to tear through the glass and rip open the doors of this facility and drag every child out with his own hands. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. "I'm going to fix this," he said softly. Elijah looked up. "How?" Malcolm hesitated. "Just trust me." They ended the visit when the guards gave the signal, cold and abrupt, like turning off a light. Elijah stood slowly. "Don't forget about me, okay?" "Never," Malcolm said, watching him disappear through the metal door. The walk out of the facility was longer than the walk in, or maybe it just felt that way. He passed the same scuffed floors, the same tired guard behind the thick window, but now each detail felt carved into him. Outside, the night had fallen like a curtain. The wind was sharp, but Malcolm didn't go home right away. He sat in his car, staring into the darkness, breathing in silence, until the ache in his chest finally forced him to move. When he got home, the house was empty, too quiet. He walked through the rooms like a ghost. The kitchen lights glowed softly. A single photo of Elijah on the fridge, grinning, arms raised in victory after scoring a goal, mocked the horror of the day. Malcolm's hands shook as he poured himself a glass of water, but he couldn't drink it. The glass trembled in his grip. He set it down. He walked to his office, a small room, shelves lined with legal volumes, commendations on the walls, DOJ plaques, a framed copy of the Civil Rights Act annotated with his notes, his work, his life. He opened the drawer, and there it was, his badge, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Senior Legal Advisor. The emblem glinted under the desk lamp. He picked it up, held it in his hand. It felt heavier than it ever had, not because of the metal, but because of what it represented. Power, access, leverage, everything Elijah didn't have. He stared at it for a long time. He could end this tomorrow. He could walk into the courthouse, flash the badge, and turn the system inside out. But would that fix anything, or just make him the exception? He set the badge down, slowly, deliberately. Because Malcolm Hayes had decided something far more dangerous than exposure. He would watch, he would wait, and he would document every lie, every injustice, every corner the system cut in trying to bury his son alive. Because this time, he wouldn't fight back as an officer of the law. He would fight back as a father who knew the system better than the men abusing it. He would let them believe they had won, and then, when the time was right, he would burn the entire thing down. Malcolm closed the drawer, sat back in his chair, and whispered to the empty room, "You started this. You're going to regret it." The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation, the kind that creeps under the skin and settles in the bones. Everything felt rehearsed, the shuffle of papers, the low murmur of the gallery, the mechanical clicking of the court reporter's keys. But for Malcolm Hayes, nothing about this was routine. His son's life was on the line, and everyone in that room acted like it was just another file on a crowded docket. Behind the elevated bench, Judge Sharon Whitmore adjusted her glasses, emotionless as always. She hadn't changed since the sentencing. Her gavel had condemned Elijah to 5 years in juvenile detention, with the same energy someone might use to read off a parking violation. And now she was back, stoic, dismissive, already leaning toward the prosecution before a single argument had been made. Malcolm sat in the second row, unmoving, unreadable, but fire churned beneath his calm exterior. And when he looked across the room and saw Daniel Mercer stand to address the court, that fire ignited into something colder, something sharper. Daniel, the man he once mentored, the intern he guided through his first federal hearing, now wearing a smug navy suit and a perfectly rehearsed smirk, he stood ready to bury the son of the very man who helped shape his career. "Your Honor," Mercer began with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome before the jury had been selected, "the state intends to show that the defendant, Elijah Hayes, acted with deliberate hostility toward a law enforcement officer. His behavior was not only confrontational, but dangerous." He turned to the jury with a dramatic pause, letting the phrase hang in the air like a loaded weapon. He was given multiple chances to de-escalate the situation. He chose instead to provoke and threaten a sworn officer. "We ask this court to hold him accountable for those actions." Malcolm clenched his jaw. Lies dressed in courtroom polish. He could already see the direction Mercer was taking it. Frame the boy as aggressive, the officer as noble, and watch the jury nod along. It was a script that had played out for generations, and today it had a new cast. The prosecution calls Officer Kevin Rourke to the stand. The courtroom door opened, and Rourke entered with the swagger of a man who had nothing to fear and everything to gain. His uniform was spotless, his expression cool. He took the oath without flinching and settled into the witness seat like he owned it. "Officer Rourke," Mercer began, "can you describe your encounter with the defendant?" Rourke nodded solemnly. "I was on patrol near 9th and Lee, area known for illegal activity. That's when I spotted the defendant, pacing near a gas station, looked nervous, kept checking over his shoulder." "And what did you do?" "I approached, asked him what he was doing. He got defensive right away, said, 'Why are you following me?' His tone was aggressive. His posture was hostile." "Did he make any threatening moves?" Rourke's voice hardened. "He stepped toward me, quickly, reached into his pocket. I had no idea what he was grabbing." "And how did you respond?" "I restrained him, used approved tactics. No excessive force." Every word was polished, practiced, false, and every nod from Mercer only cemented the illusion further. Malcolm gripped the bench in front of him, knuckles pale. He wanted to shout, to stand, to remind the room who Rourke really was, a man caught in 3 misconduct reports, all buried in internal reviews. But this wasn't his moment, not yet. "Was a weapon found?" Mercer asked, already knowing the answer. "No," Rourke admitted. "Turned out to be his phone. But I couldn't take that risk." The jury barely reacted, as if pulling a phone was justification enough to slam a teenager to the pavement. Judge Whitmore didn't blink. She scribbled something in her notepad without looking up. "Thank you, officer," Mercer said smoothly. "No further questions." Rourke stepped down like a war hero returning from battle. Malcolm's stomach twisted. The lie had landed. The jury believed it. He could see it in their eyes. Acceptance, quiet agreement, maybe even relief. The story made sense to them. Young black male, nervous, reaching into a pocket. Must have been up to no good. The public defender, Wallace, rose from his seat. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a page from his notes. Your Honor, the defense would like to call attention to the inconsistencies in the officer's statement. Objection, Mercer interrupted immediately. The defense is attempting to reframe sworn testimony without presenting new evidence. Sustained, Judge Whitmore replied before Wallace could finish his sentence. Malcolm blinked slowly. The air grew colder. Wallace tried again. We respectfully request to view surveillance footage from the gas station. Objection. This request was not filed in pretrial discovery. Sustained. Wallace's voice cracked. Your Honor, this is critical to our case. There's a chance this footage could show that my client... The objection is sustained, Whitmore repeated, eyes narrowing. Another blow. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, watching his son's case be dismantled, one objection at a time. Wallace shuffled through his notes in desperation. Then, Your Honor, we'd like to submit a character letter from Elijah's principal. Objection. On what grounds? Wallace dared to ask. Mercer didn't flinch. Relevance. Whitmore's reply was immediate. Sustained. Malcolm's fingers twitched on the bench. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. They weren't just ignoring the defense. They were erasing it. Every question, every motion, every attempt at balance was met with Mercer's arrogant voice and Whitmore's approving nod. Wallace stood frozen, eyes scanning his remaining notes like he was searching for a miracle. But there was nothing, just silence. I have nothing further, Wallace said quietly. Judge Whitmore leaned back. Very well, then we'll proceed. And that's when Malcolm stood up. The sound of his chair scraping back echoed across the courtroom like a gunshot. Every head turned. Whitmore blinked in irritation. Sir, if you don't remain seated, I'll have the bailiff escort you. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He simply held up a thick folder in his hand, a manila document with the seal of the United States Department of Justice burned into the cover. Your Honor, he said calmly, voice resonant with quiet power, before you proceed, I think it's important to inform this court that I am the author of the federal policy your courtroom is currently violating. Dead silence. Judge Whitmore's mouth froze mid-command. Mercer stopped writing. The jury shifted. Malcolm took one step forward. This isn't just a case about a boy being misjudged. It's about a system collapsing under its own corruption. And I've spent the last 20 years drafting the safeguards that are meant to stop it. Whitmore narrowed her eyes. You are not counsel in this case, and I strongly advise you. I'm not here as counsel, Malcolm said, voice rising now. I'm here as a father and a federal legal advisor, Senior Civil Rights Division, Department of Justice, badge number 720-89H, and I'm watching you violate federal rights in real time. For a full 3 seconds, the entire courtroom seemed to forget how to breathe. Malcolm Hayes stood dead center in the aisle, spine straight, eyes locked onto Judge Sharon Whitmore. In his hand was a small leather wallet, plain, unassuming, until he flipped it open and raised it for everyone to see. The golden badge inside gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. Beneath it, the laminated ID read, Malcolm Hayes, Senior Legal Advisor, Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice. The air evaporated from the room. The bailiff, halfway through stepping forward to remove him, froze mid-motion. The clerk stopped typing. Even the jurors, stone-faced and disinterested until now, sat up straight. Only one person spoke, and his voice dropped like a bomb. I am not just Elijah Hayes' father, Malcolm said, voice unwavering, low and thunderous. I am a senior legal advisor for the United States Department of Justice, and I have spent the last 2 decades crafting, reviewing, and enforcing the very civil rights policies this courtroom has trampled on. Gas rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitmore stiffened behind the bench, her fingers curling slowly around her gavel. But she didn't strike it. Not yet. Mercer, formerly the most composed man in the room, went ghost pale, His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He had no rebuttal prepared for this, because how could he? His former mentor had just turned the entire case on its head with 10 words. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence now swallowed the room whole. I watched, he continued, voice calm but heavy with rage, as my son was silenced, misrepresented, and discarded by a courtroom that had already made up its mind. I listened to a prosecutor twist facts, watched a police officer lie under oath, and observed a judge who refused to question anything that didn't fit the narrative she'd already chosen. He paused, letting the words hit like bullets. And I stayed silent because I needed to see for myself how deep the rot runs. Now Whitmore's hand trembled ever so slightly on the bench. She tried to compose herself. "Mr. Hayes, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular?" Malcolm interrupted, voice rising. "Is a courtroom where objections are sustained before arguments are even made, where a child is branded a criminal without evidence, where a judge ignores legal procedure to protect a performance, not justice." No one dared interrupt him. "I helped write the national standards for body camera requirements. I wrote the Department of Justice's guidance on the treatment of minors during arrest, and I helped author the very protocols that require transparency, not convenience." He took one step forward, measured, unstoppable. "If this courtroom continues down this path, you're not just looking at a bad verdict. You're looking at a federal investigation." The room collapsed into silence again, a heavy, suffocating stillness. Even Elijah stared at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. The man who raised him with patience and quiet dignity was now a force of law. Malcolm's badge still glinted in the light. He slowly lowered it. "I tried to let this system work. I tried to be a father in the back row, but you forced me to be something else." Judge Whitmore didn't speak. Mercer didn't move. The courtroom had lost control, and everyone knew it. Malcolm returned to his seat, slowly, calmly, like a man who had just detonated a bomb and was now waiting for the dust to settle. He folded his hands, and this time no one dared stop him. The silence in the courtroom had gone from stunned to suffocating. Every pair of eyes was locked on Malcolm Hayes, who stood not as a grieving father now, but as something much more dangerous. A man with knowledge, with power, and now, with evidence. He placed a thick black binder on the prosecution's table with a thud that echoed across the room like a hammer strike. Daniel Mercer flinched. Even Judge Whitmore tilted slightly forward, suddenly unsure whether she was still in control of the room. Malcolm looked directly at her. "With the court's indulgence," he said coldly, "I'd like to submit new evidence, previously withheld by the prosecution." Mercer stood too quickly, voice cracking. "Your Honor, we object. This is improper procedure." But Malcolm cut him off, his voice slicing clean through Mercer's panic. "Improper? The only thing improper is the prosecution's decision to hide these documents from discovery." He opened the binder and pulled out the first document, a complaint form. Exhibit A, an internal affairs report filed against Officer Kevin Rourke by a 16-year-old boy in 2021. The charges: excessive force, intimidation, verbal threats. He tossed the copy onto the judge's bench. The courtroom gasped. Malcolm continued, calm and devastating. "The complaint was buried after a lack of evidence was cited. The only problem? It was never investigated. No statements taken. No review board convened. The file was marked closed less than 24 hours after it was filed." Judge Whitmore shifted. "Mr. Hayes," but Malcolm wasn't done. He held up another folder. Exhibit B, an eerily similar report. Different name, different kid, same officer, same language, same outcome. He looked over at Rourke, who now sat stiffly, jaw clenched, face pale. "Tell me, officer, how many complaints does it take before a pattern becomes a fact?" Mercer tried again. "Your Honor, these files were never—" Malcolm turned sharply, his voice rising now. "You didn't submit them because you knew. You had them, Daniel. You saw the names. You saw the reports. And instead of raising concerns, you buried them." Then with surgical precision, Malcolm lifted one more file, the final nail. Exhibit C, An internal email chain between Assistant District Attorney Daniel Mercer and his staff, dated 1 week before this trial. Subject line, "Clean up before court." He walked it up to the bench and handed it directly to Judge Whitmore. "Scroll to page 2, he said. The judge did. Her eyes scanned the text, and for the first time since this trial began, her face changed. The mask cracked. The gavel in her hand trembled slightly. "Read it aloud," Malcolm said. She didn't move, so he did it for her. He turned to the jury. Quote, "Let's make sure there are no surprises with Rourke's record. Flag anything that could cause a scene. The last thing we need is this kid's dad turning this into a circus." The courtroom exploded with murmurs. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward. Phones buzzed to life. Even the bailiff's composure faltered. Malcolm's voice dropped to a growl. "You knew exactly who I was, Daniel. You just hoped I wouldn't speak." Mercer's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Malcolm paced now, calm and deliberate. "I spent my career writing the rules to prevent things like this. I helped craft federal oversight protocols so that prosecutors couldn't manipulate trials and officers couldn't fabricate threats." He turned back toward the judge. "And yet, here we are." Judge Whitmore swallowed hard, her words suddenly slow and cautious. "These are serious accusations." "They're more than accusations," Malcolm replied, fire in his voice. "They're facts, documented, time-stamped, unredacted, and admissible." He gestured to Elijah, who sat still, stunned, watching his father become the shield he never thought he had. "This isn't just about my son. It's about every name that never made it into this room. Every kid who didn't have a lawyer, or a father, or a badge to protect them." He looked back at the jury. "Think about how close you came to sending an innocent boy away, based on a lie." The room was no longer a courtroom. It was a powder keg. Mercer slumped back into his seat, defeated. Rourke looked like he was trying to disappear into the floor. Whitmore sat frozen, knowing that every decision she made from this point forward would be watched, not just by the people in that room, but by a nation. Because Malcolm Hayes wasn't just a witness anymore. He was the embodiment of the law. He had written it, and now he was wielding it. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but the weight in the air said everything had already changed. Malcolm stepped back, calm and silent once again. But the silence now belonged to him. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. By sunrise, the fire had already spread. It started as a clip, 34 seconds long, filmed on a shaky phone camera by a freelance journalist sitting in the back row of the courtroom. The moment Malcolm Hayes stood, raised his DOJ badge, and declared that the system had just violated the very laws he helped write. The caption was simple: DOJ Senior Legal Advisor exposes corruption in son's trial, must watch. Within hours, it wasn't just being watched, it was being dissected, reposted, analyzed frame by frame. By noon, the clip had over 2 million views. By evening, it had gone global. News anchors called it an unprecedented courtroom intervention. Legal scholars called it a constitutional reckoning. But for the people who had lived it, for the communities who had been bruised, silenced, and forgotten, it was something else entirely. It was a call to war. Outside the East Baton Rouge courthouse, the sidewalk flooded with protesters before the first light turned green. Signs shot up like swords. Justice for Elijah, end the pipeline. We are all Elijah Hayes. Some were handwritten. Others were printed by the hundreds. Chants rang out, rhythmic and rising. No justice, no peace. Black lives, black laws, black power. Malcolm didn't lie. Whitmore must resign. Local reporters struggled to keep up, but by mid-afternoon, the media circus had swelled beyond control. CNN rolled live coverage from the courthouse steps. MSNBC aired a 3-part legal breakdown of the case, led by 2 former DOJ attorneys, both of whom openly condemned the trial's blatant constitutional violations. Fox News aired it too, though their coverage focused less on justice and more on an escalating federal overreach into local authority. But no one could deny the storm. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about what Elijah represented. The federal agents arrived like thunderclouds. No press conference, no warning, just unmarked vehicles, stern faces, and black DOJ jackets pouring into the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse before sunrise. By 7 a.m., the building was surrounded. Staffers were escorted out. Files were seized. Computer hard drives removed. Phones confiscated. The Department of Justice had launched its full-scale investigation. Judge Whitmore's chambers were the first to be locked down. Her office lights were still off when the knock came. By the time she opened the door in her robe, she was already no longer in charge. "We have a federal order," the lead agent said, holding up a document with the department seal. "Step aside." Outside, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters jostled for space. Protesters lined the steps with banners that read, "Let the system collapse," and "We stand with Elijah." Microphones pointed at the courthouse like weapons. And at the center of it all stood Malcolm Hayes, calm, focused, and carrying a single briefcase. He stepped up to the podium. No notes, no speech, just the truth, sharp and ready. "Thank you for coming," he said. "There's more you need to see." He opened the briefcase and lifted out a hard drive, a folder, and a stack of printed transcripts. These are the things that weren't supposed to surface, evidence that was withheld, records that were sealed, complaints that were lost, all of it, collected, verified, and cross-checked by independent counsel. He handed the materials to the federal officials beside him. Cameras zoomed in as the lead investigator flipped through a report marked "Confidential," "Suppressed files." "Let me walk you through just a few of them." Malcolm pulled a small remote from his pocket. A projector behind him flickered on, casting a grainy video onto a mobile screen. "In this footage," Malcolm narrated, "you'll see Officer Kevin Rourke during a 2021 arrest of another black teenager. 16, no weapon, same location. The body cam was mysteriously missing during trial, but the gas station security camera caught it." The video played. The crowd gasped. Rourke was shown slamming a teen into a patrol car. No resistance, just brutality. "And here," Malcolm switched the feed, "a 2022 audio recording from a public defender's office line. The voice is Daniel Mercer's, talking about which records to withhold so the jury doesn't get confused by the history." Gasps turned to shouting. Reporters scrambled to update their live streams. "This," Malcolm continued, holding up a dusty folder, "is the original complaint filed against Judge Sharon Whitmore in 2019. A case where a defense attorney alleged racially biased sentencing. It was buried in an internal memo. No action was taken. By now you could hear a pin drop." Malcolm looked over the crowd, the courthouse, the agents, the flashing cameras, and he saw it. The system unraveling. A journalist in the front row finally broke the silence. "Mr. Hayes," she called out, breathless, "why didn't you reveal who you were from the start? Why didn't you say you worked for the Department of Justice?" Every mic turned toward him. Malcolm paused, then looked directly into the camera and said without blinking, "Because I wanted to see how far they'd go. I wanted to know how they would treat my son if he didn't come with a name." Gasps, silence, then applause. He continued, voice low but ringing with fury. "I wanted to feel what every black parent in this country feels when they walk into a courtroom knowing the system sees their child as guilty before a word is spoken. And what I found was worse than I expected. It wasn't just neglect. It was orchestration." He leaned into the mic. "I watched a courtroom bend truth to protect power. I watched a prosecutor I mentored twist evidence. I watched a judge nod through every lie like justice was optional." The emotion in his voice sharpened with every word. "But now," he said, raising the final folder, "we turn the lights on." Inside the courthouse, the investigation was in full swing. Federal agents pulled transcripts, combed through sentencing records, and isolated hundreds of flagged cases, all under Judge Whitmore's tenure. By noon, 3 more attorneys came forward with similar stories. Civil rights organizations began collecting testimony. Elijah's story had opened a floodgate, and the water wasn't going to stop. Malcolm stayed outside. Reporters followed him as he walked down the courthouse steps with calm dignity. Elijah was now beside him, free, quiet, still absorbing everything. Protesters made a path for them. People applauded, some cried, but Malcolm's face was steel. This wasn't over. He turned to Elijah. "You okay?" Elijah nodded, voice low. "Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" Malcolm looked at his son, eyes full of both sorrow and fire. "Because I needed to see if the law I believed in would still protect you, even when I didn't stand behind it." Elijah swallowed. "And it didn't." "No," Malcolm said. "It didn't." He looked back at the courthouse, now surrounded by federal agents and flashing cameras. "But it will now." The courthouse stood under a heavy sky, dark clouds churning restlessly overhead, mirroring the storm that had enveloped the city. After weeks of media frenzy, federal investigations, and nationwide outrage, the decision had finally come down. The case of Elijah Hayes was officially reopened. A second chance at justice, rarely granted yet impossible to deny after Malcolm Hayes tore the veil from the system's face. This wasn't just about one trial anymore. It was about confronting a rotten core, the silent injustices hidden behind polished oak and brass gavels. Elijah stepped out of the black sedan beside his father, Malcolm, dressed sharply in a tailored dark suit and tie. Gone was the frightened boy forced into a defendant's jumpsuit. Today, Elijah walked like a man who knew exactly who stood at his side and exactly what they faced. They moved past reporters, camera flashes snapping rapidly. Voices shouted from the crowd, but Malcolm kept his gaze forward, his hand lightly on Elijah's shoulder. The courthouse doors swung open, and father and son stepped into the very heart of the storm. Inside courtroom 3, Judge Whitmore had been replaced. In her seat sat Judge Angela Kendrick, flown in from Washington, impartial, professional, utterly untouched by the local political games. Cameras from major news outlets lined the back walls, their red lights blinking silently, capturing every breath, every heartbeat. Malcolm didn't sit at the back this time. He stood at the defense table, files stacked neatly, each piece of paper as sharp as a dagger. Officer Kevin Rourke sat stiffly in the witness chair, uniform pristine, but his composure clearly frayed. Across from Malcolm, the prosecution table was empty of Daniel Mercer, his career now a casualty of his own dishonesty. Malcolm turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Rourke's with laser intensity. The room went utterly silent as Malcolm stepped forward to begin his cross-examination. "Officer Rourke," Malcolm started calmly, his voice low, yet cutting through the heavy air, "can you repeat to this court, clearly and precisely, what justification you gave for arresting my son?" Rourke shifted uncomfortably, his eyes briefly flickering around the courtroom before settling back on Malcolm. He cleared his throat. I felt threatened." Malcolm paused, letting the silence sharpen into discomfort. "Threatened?" he repeated slowly. "Did Elijah threaten you verbally?" "No." "Did he have a weapon?" "No." "Did he raise his hands to attack?" Rourke hesitated. "Not exactly." Malcolm cut him off sharply. "Answer clearly, officer. Did he physically attack you or raise his hands in aggression?" "No," Rourke admitted, almost whispering now. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. "Then, Officer Rourke, please explain to me, and to this court, exactly what my son did that made you feel threatened enough to violently arrest him?" Rourke's fingers clenched the arms of the witness chair. He avoided Malcolm's eyes. His confidence, once ironclad, was eroding rapidly under the intensity of Malcolm's relentless questioning. "I believed he posed a risk." Rourke stumbled through his response, but his voice cracked, betraying uncertainty. "A risk?" Malcolm's voice hardened like steel. "Based on what evidence?" Silence echoed. Malcolm pressed harder. "Answer me. Was it his words? His actions? What exactly did Elijah Hayes do?" Rourke shifted again, his face reddening, sweat breaking across his brow. "It wasn't exactly what he did, it was what, officer?" Rourke's voice faltered. "It was how he looked at me." The courtroom froze, the silence turning heavy, almost unbearable. Even the reporters stopped writing. Malcolm let the words hover. "How he looked at you?" Malcolm repeated, the disbelief in his voice palpable. "Clarify, officer." Rourke's breathing became visibly erratic, a sheen of sweat glistening across his forehead. He, he looked at me like he was defiant, like I was nothing. Malcolm's voice went dangerously quiet. So let me get this straight. You violently arrested my 16-year-old son, charged him falsely, took away months of his life, simply because you didn't like the way he looked at you? Rourke didn't respond. Malcolm stepped even closer, eyes blazing. Officer Rourke, do you understand the gravity of what you just said? Do you understand the level of abuse and injustice hidden behind that statement? Rourke looked down, defeated. I didn't like the way he stared. It made me uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? Malcolm's voice was lethal, each syllable carefully weighted. Because a young black boy looked you in the eye? The courtroom murmured loudly. Cameras flashed urgently. Judge Kendrick leaned forward, but didn't interrupt, her own eyes wide with shock. Tell me, officer, Malcolm continued fiercely, how many other children have you arrested because you didn't like the way they looked at you? How many lives have you ruined with your discomfort? Rourke had no answer. He sat speechless, a man stripped bare before the world. Malcolm turned slowly, addressing the jury directly. Members of the jury, my son lost his freedom, his dignity, and nearly lost his future, all because this officer didn't like his gaze. Elijah's real crime? Refusing to lower his eyes, refusing to surrender his dignity, refusing to be invisible. The words resonated through the courtroom, vibrating with bitter truth. Malcolm glanced back at Elijah, who sat tall, his gaze steady, eyes unafraid. A young man who had survived being crushed beneath the weight of prejudice, now standing unbowed, defiant, and proud. Turning once more to Rourke, Malcolm's voice turned ice cold, cutting through the silence like a blade. Officer Rourke, in this courtroom today, the only threat revealed is you, your badge, your authority, your prejudice. A man with power who abused it simply because he could. Rourke remained silent, utterly exposed. Judge Kendrick finally leaned into her microphone, breaking the silence gently yet firmly. Mr. Hayes, any further questions? Malcolm stepped back, taking a slow breath. No further questions, Your Honor. He returned to Elijah's side, placing a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. Elijah looked up at him, a hint of gratitude and pride shining in his eyes. The jury shifted uncomfortably, processing the damning truth laid bare. In the gallery, reporters hurriedly typed, capturing the explosive testimony, sending headlines across the globe. Officer admits, arrested DOJ advisor's son for how he looked at me. Trial revelation, justice blinded by a stare. The city, no, the nation was watching. Millions saw firsthand how fragile justice could be when balanced on prejudice and power. Malcolm squeezed Elijah's shoulder softly, speaking low enough only he could hear. You've done enough, son. Let justice do the rest. Elijah nodded silently, a quiet strength settling into his features. Judge Kendrick paused carefully before addressing the jury, her voice resonating with authority and weight. Ladies and gentlemen, today you have witnessed a profound injustice exposed. Consider carefully what you've heard. The foundation of this court, and every court, is fairness, evidence, and truth. Not fear, not bias, certainly not prejudice. She paused, scanning each face slowly. Justice delayed can no longer be justice denied. Malcolm sat beside Elijah, heart heavy yet lighter than it had been in months. The courtroom, once a stage for corruption and silence, now belonged to the truth, and the truth had spoken louder than any prejudice ever could. Elijah, once reduced to a mere prisoner, sat tall. His quiet dignity had spoken volumes, and in that moment, Malcolm knew that justice, real justice, was finally within reach. Because today, the truth had not blinked. Today, the truth had stared injustice squarely in the eye, and injustice had looked away first. For Malcolm Hayes, for Elijah, for everyone watching, this was not just another day in court. This was a reckoning. The courtroom was utterly silent, the air heavy with anticipation, charged with a kind of raw electricity that only justice delayed could generate. Reporters leaned forward, cameras aimed, fingers poised above keyboards, ready to capture every nuance of the moment. Elijah Hayes sat tall beside his father, Malcolm, both men unflinching beneath the weight of countless eyes. Judge Kendrick adjusted her reading glasses slowly, eyes calm yet focused, the gravity of the decision evident in every line on her face. She glanced briefly toward Officer Rourke, whose head remained bowed in shame and defeat, then back toward Elijah, whose gaze held steady, a testament to courage forged from injustice. The judge took a slow breath, the room tensed, and then her voice echoed clearly, calmly yet powerfully. Having thoroughly reviewed all evidence, testimonies, and investigative reports presented by both sides, this court finds no credible grounds for the charges against Elijah Hayes. Effective immediately, all charges are dismissed, and the record will reflect his complete and unconditional exoneration. The courtroom erupted. A roar surged upward, a tidal wave of emotion. Relief, joy, and vindication mingled as one. People stood from their seats, clapping, cheering, shouting Elijah's name as cameras flashed, reporters jostling to broadcast the news instantaneously to millions around the world. Outside the courthouse, thousands gathered around televisions and live streams, their collective voices swelling into a chorus of justice reclaimed. It was more than celebration, it was defiance, a reclaiming of the dignity stolen from so many others who never made headlines, whose lives slipped through the cracks of the same broken system Elijah had barely survived. Yet amid the jubilation, one man remained silent, unmoving. Malcolm Hayes sat still, his jaw tense, hands folded tightly on the table before him, eyes narrowed not in anger, but in profound reflection. His silence was louder than any cheer, heavier than any verdict. He was not smiling. He was not celebrating. His quiet presence, a steady force that had brought the courtroom to its knees, now exuded something deeper, a wisdom that victory in one case was merely a drop in an ocean filled with thousands of invisible injustices. Judge Kendrick tapped her gavel, gradually restoring silence. She leaned forward slightly, eyes filled with respect and sincerity. Elijah Hayes, this court apologizes deeply for the injustice you have endured. You are free to go. Elijah slowly rose, turning toward his father. The young man's eyes were bright, yet he saw something in Malcolm's face, a truth deeper than relief. Malcolm stood too, but his expression remained severe, intense. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed rapidly, but Malcolm raised one hand calmly, waiting until the chaos simmered down. Finally, when silence was restored, Malcolm spoke. His voice was deep, unwavering, and carried the weight of every injustice he'd witnessed. Today, we witnessed the law finally doing what it was always meant to do. We've seen a wrong corrected. My son Elijah is innocent, but we must understand this clearly. One trial, one verdict, one moment of justice does not erase the thousands of wrongful convictions still out there. His voice sharpened, each word delivered with calculated precision. My son's innocence has been restored. But what about those who don't have fathers working in the Department of Justice? What about the countless young men and women whose innocence is buried beneath procedural errors, hidden evidence, and systemic prejudice? Who speaks for them? The cheering had faded completely now, replaced by heavy silence. Every camera lens focused intently on Malcolm's face, his words reverberating far beyond the courtroom walls. He took a step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elijah, his eyes blazing with righteous determination. I am proud of my son, of his courage, his strength, but I refuse to celebrate today as a complete victory, because until every wrongful conviction is reversed, until every courtroom sees truth instead of prejudice, our work, my work, is not finished. His gaze swept slowly around the room, meeting every pair of eyes directly. His voice became softer, yet no less powerful. This case, my son's case, is not unique. Elijah is fortunate. His injustice was visible, documented, fought for. But what about the invisible? Those who suffer silently without voices to advocate for them. Today, let Elijah Hayes stand not just as a symbol of personal triumph, but as a call to action. Malcolm raised his hand, gesturing toward the reporters. You, the media, have power. Do not forget this story tomorrow, next week, or next year. Do not reduce it to headlines or sound bites. Let Elijah's victory serve as a challenge, a reminder to dig deeper, to expose hidden truths, to fight harder against injustice wherever it lives. Malcolm turned to Elijah briefly, placing a steady hand on his son's shoulder. Elijah's eyes shimmered, pride mingling with the realization of the weight he now carried. Malcolm's voice grew softer yet sharper, the edge cutting clearly through the silence. I want each person listening today to think about those who do not have the privilege of public outrage, who do not have their stories told. Elijah was lucky because his father had a voice. But true justice cannot depend on luck, family connections, or media attention. He stepped closer to the reporters, eyes blazing with conviction. Justice must become routine, ordinary, expected, not a rare event worthy of cheering. It is our collective responsibility to demand accountability, not just today, but every day. Malcolm stepped back, breathing deeply, the weight of the moment pressing upon him visibly. His voice quieted again, filled now with deep, resonating empathy. For my son Elijah, today means freedom. But we must never confuse one individual's freedom with systemic change. This fight is only beginning. For every Elijah, there are thousands more, waiting silently in prisons, cells, and juvenile centers across this nation, praying that someone sees them as worthy of justice. He looked once more around the packed courtroom, holding the collective breath of the nation. I will not rest until that justice, real justice, is delivered to every one of them. Malcolm stepped back, pulling Elijah close, holding him firmly by the shoulder. For a moment, father and son stood there silently, an unbreakable unity forged through hardship, injustice, and the unyielding fight for truth. Then slowly, Malcolm guided Elijah toward the doors, leaving the courtroom in profound, thoughtful silence. A silence heavier, more meaningful than any cheers or applause. As they exited, reporters began quietly murmuring among themselves, the magnitude of Malcolm's words settling over them like a heavy cloak. Headlines quickly formed, not of shallow triumph, but of renewed responsibility. Elijah freed, but Malcolm Hayes warns. Justice still out of reach. A father's powerful message. My son's victory means nothing if others remain unseen. Stepping out into daylight, father and son faced a crowd waiting eagerly. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, yet Malcolm walked calmly past, arm firmly around Elijah's shoulder, unbothered by their questions. Because today wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning. Malcolm knew this courtroom victory was a small step, a necessary one, but far from enough. He had made a promise, a commitment not just to his son, but to thousands of sons and daughters who still waited, still suffered. Their faces were with him now, engraved deeply within his mind. And as he walked forward, holding Elijah close, Malcolm Hayes silently vowed again, today we fight, but tomorrow we keep fighting, until justice becomes ordinary, until justice becomes expected, until justice truly applies equally to everyone. The verdict echoed far beyond courtroom walls, reverberating through streets, offices, and neighborhoods, shaking the foundations of a justice system long overdue for scrutiny. Elijah Hayes walked free, but the ripples of his ordeal would reshape an entire nation. Within days, the machinery of federal justice began to move with a newfound sense of urgency. Washington, D.C. became a hive of activity. Phones rang incessantly, offices stayed lit through the night, and sealed files spilled their secrets under the careful eyes of DOJ investigators. This wasn't a mere symbolic gesture. It was a reckoning, a cleansing storm rolling relentlessly toward anyone who had profited from injustice. At precisely 7 a.m. on a brisk Tuesday morning, FBI agents escorted Officer Kevin Rourke from his home, in full view of stunned neighbors. Rourke had spent years shielded by a uniform that demanded blind respect. Now, stripped of badge and authority, he was nothing more than another disgraced figure awaiting judgment. Cameras flashed furiously as Rourke moved silently through the press gauntlet, head lowered, eyes avoiding the relentless gaze of a society finally holding him accountable. Reporters shouted questions, but he uttered no words. His silence was deafening, heavy with shame and defeat. The once proud officer who had arrested Elijah simply because he disliked the defiant look in his eyes was now publicly suspended, awaiting a full criminal investigation. Across town, the consequences for Daniel Mercer were unfolding even more dramatically. The ambitious prosecutor who had carefully built his career on a foundation of half-truths and strategic silence was now cornered, trapped by the very lies he had sown. A dozen federal agents in dark suits poured into Mercer's office, carrying subpoenas and warrants. Boxes of documents, hidden emails, and encrypted digital communications were systematically unearthed, cataloged, and scrutinized under glaring fluorescent lights. Mercer himself sat motionless, eyes empty, face pale, watching helplessly as his legacy disintegrated page by incriminating page. Federal agents moved around him like shadows, dismantling a career built on deception. When asked by an investigator why he'd withheld critical evidence, Mercer offered only one broken whisper. "I thought nobody would ever find out." But justice had finally turned its harsh spotlight upon him, illuminating every hidden truth. Mercer's words hung limply in the air, meaningless now in the face of accountability. Outside, the media's attention remained unwavering. Headlines screamed from every direction, capturing the full extent of the crisis, shaking the local judicial establishment. DOJ takes action, officer suspended, prosecutor under federal investigation. Malcolm Hayes watched it all with grim satisfaction. Not joy, not vengeance, but the quiet knowledge that justice, though painfully delayed, had finally arrived. Yet Malcolm was not content simply to watch from afar. He understood clearly that one verdict, one investigation, even one prosecution, was merely scratching the surface. True change demanded sustained action, and Malcolm knew precisely where to begin. In the aftermath of Elijah's trial, Malcolm resigned his senior advisory position at the DOJ, a decision met initially with shock and confusion from colleagues who could not imagine the Civil Rights Division without him. But Malcolm was clear. "My fight is no longer behind a desk in Washington," he declared resolutely during his final meeting. "My place is out there, on the ground, protecting those who cannot protect themselves." With steely determination, Malcolm turned his formidable energies to a new mission, one born from personal pain and fueled by profound conviction. Within weeks, he officially announced the creation of a groundbreaking advocacy organization, aptly named Eyes Open, Justice for Black Youth. The name resonated deeply, a tribute to Elijah's fierce, unyielding gaze that had ignited Officer Rourke's prejudice, and symbolizing Malcolm's pledge that no child would ever again suffer simply because someone disliked the look in their eyes. Eyes Open quickly gained momentum, mobilizing a diverse coalition of civil rights attorneys, former federal prosecutors, social activists, and thousands of families who had silently suffered beneath the weight of systemic injustice. Malcolm didn't merely gather support, he rallied warriors, men and women hardened by adversity, ready to dismantle decades of racial bias hiding beneath polished oak courtrooms and carefully worded verdicts. The headquarters of Eyes Open became a relentless engine of activity. Volunteers tirelessly analyzing wrongful arrest reports, dedicated attorneys reviewing closed case files, and social workers reaching out to families shattered by unjust imprisonment. Malcolm led every meeting personally, speaking quietly yet fiercely, never losing sight of the mission. "This isn't charity," he declared emphatically at the inaugural meeting, his voice echoing powerfully through the packed hall. "This is obligation. This is our chance to fight for those who the system ignores, silences, and discards. Our children must no longer face the courtroom alone." News spread quickly. Celebrities, philanthropists, and activists pledged their support, eager to join a movement rooted in undeniable truth and relentless determination. Malcolm soon stood shoulder to shoulder with influential allies, their collective presence impossible to ignore. But his most powerful ally remained Elijah, who had become an emblem of resilience and justice. Standing beside Malcolm at every rally, press conference, and community meeting, Elijah's presence spoke louder than words ever could. His steady eyes, once viewed as defiant and dangerous, now inspired crowds to believe real change was possible. The movement grew rapidly. Local governments began reform initiatives to rebuild trust, hastily revising protocols on body cameras, accountability, and transparency. Legislation started appearing in state houses across the nation, each bill directly influenced by Malcolm's relentless advocacy. But despite these victories, Malcolm never relaxed his vigilance. Every day brought new challenges, new threats, and reminders of how deeply prejudice remained entrenched within powerful institutions. Yet he pressed forward, unyielding, refusing to declare victory prematurely. Months after the trial, Malcolm stood at a massive rally held outside the courthouse, where Elijah's nightmare had begun. Thousands gathered, chanting slogans of defiance and hope. Banners waved, signs bearing Elijah's name held high, symbols now of collective strength. Malcolm stepped confidently to the microphone, Elijah standing proudly beside him. The crowd roared approval, voices blending into a single powerful cry for lasting justice. When the cheering faded, Malcolm spoke clearly, deliberately, the strength in his voice matched by quiet urgency. My son is free today because our fight became public, but our work is far from done. Tonight as we gather here, countless Elijahs still sit behind bars, voiceless, forgotten, abandoned by a system that sees only their skin and not their innocence. He paused, the weight of every unjustly imprisoned child clearly etched in his expression. We must never rest, never be satisfied, never declare victory until every child's dignity is restored, until every officer, prosecutor, and judge understands clearly that power demands responsibility. Malcolm's voice rose, filled with passion and unshakable resolve. Eyes Open exists not just to protect Black youth, but to remind our justice system that accountability must be blind to color, class, or convenience. We will no longer remain silent. We will no longer lower our eyes, because every child deserves the right to look justice squarely in the face, without fear. Cheers erupted once again, shaking the courthouse steps beneath their feet. Elijah stood beside his father, tall and proud, eyes shining with quiet courage, a testament to strength forged through struggle. That night, beneath the glare of media spotlights, a father and son left the courthouse steps together, bound forever by shared purpose. The work ahead would be daunting, exhausting, and often painful, but Malcolm knew he was not alone. His son stood beside him, their community stood behind them, and now a nation watched closely, demanding true change. In the end, Malcolm's greatest victory wasn't just Elijah's freedom, nor Rourke's suspension, nor Mercer's investigation. It was this movement, this undeniable awakening that promised lasting transformation. Because for Malcolm Hayes, Elijah's case was never the end of the battle. It was merely the spark that ignited a wildfire of change, a fire fueled by justice, strengthened by truth, and destined to burn away injustice wherever it hid. And Malcolm vowed silently, standing strong beside his son, that he would never allow those flames to die. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Justice cannot and must not depend on who you are, the position you hold, or the connections you have. Malcolm Hayes' battle began as a desperate father protecting his child, but it became a powerful reminder that real justice is blind to identity, privilege, or prejudice. Elijah's freedom was won only because Malcolm had the authority and knowledge to fight, but thousands of others remain voiceless, trapped by a system that values perception over truth. True justice should not demand wealth, fame, or power. It should simply require evidence, fairness, and integrity. Malcolm's journey reveals an undeniable truth. Until every person receives equal treatment under the law, until innocence is defended as fiercely for the unknown as for the influential, justice remains incomplete. Real change will come only when society demands accountability for every person, not because of who they are, but because justice itself demands nothing less than absolute truth.